The air in the Summit Heights Federal Courthouse was thick with anticipation. It wasn't just another legal proceeding. It was a spectacle, a moment in history waiting to unfold. Reporters filled every available seat, their pens poised, cameras clicking, whispers spreading like wildfire. Political analysts from both coasts had flown in. This wasn't merely about law. It was about influence, power, and the consequences of a single statement. Karoline Leavitt stepped through the grand wooden doors, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. She didn't flinch at the flashing lights or the hushed murmurs trailing in her wake. Dressed in a navy blazer, her blonde hair pulled neatly back, she carried no notes, no entourage, only an unshakable sense of purpose. All rise. The command rippled through the room as Judge Malcolm Travers entered, his black robes swaying with each step. He surveyed the courtroom, his sharp gaze settling on the defense table where Karoline sat, calm and composed. "Miss Leavitt," he said, a hint of amusement in his tone, "I trust you won't be treating this courtroom like your usual press briefings." A wave of soft laughter spread through the gallery. Karoline remained still, unfazed. Across the aisle, Special Counsel Elliot Drayton stood, adjusting his silver tie, his confidence evident in the way he carried himself. He stepped forward with a theatrical pause, a script rehearsed to perfection. "We are here today," he began, "because a public servant chose to use her position not to inform, but to influence." He held up a printed transcript. On February 15th, during an official White House press briefing, Ms. Leavitt stated, and I quote, "Our northern trade rivals are on their knees thanks to President Trump's tariff brilliance." A low murmur spread through the room. Some reporters scribbled furiously, others nodded knowingly. Drayton continued, his voice steady. This was not policy analysis. It was promotional language, a clear violation of the Hatch Act, which prohibits federal employees from engaging in political advocacy while acting in their official capacity. He walked toward the jury, placing the transcript on the evidence table with a deliberate gesture. We must ask, was this press secretary speaking for the public, or was she campaigning on the taxpayer's dime? Karoline remained motionless. Judge Travers leaned back. "Miss Leavitt, do you plan to respond today, or will you remain in strategic silence?" More laughter. This time quieter but weighted with expectation. Just then, Drayton reached into his briefcase and produced a flash drive. "Your Honor," he announced, "we have received new evidence, a recorded audio clip submitted anonymously this morning." The air in the room shifted. Reporters sat forward. Even the judge narrowed his eyes. Drayton held up the drive. "This recording allegedly captures Miss Leavitt off microphone saying, 'They deserve it. Anyone standing against America deserves what's coming.'" Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A journalist whispered, "This just blew open." Drayton turned to the judge. "We request that this recording be submitted as supplemental evidence for the jury's review." Judge Travers nodded. "We will review its admissibility." The gallery buzzed, some in skepticism, others in anticipation. The weight of the accusation pressed heavy against the walls of the courtroom. To many, the case already seemed tilted, and yet, Karoline remained still, silent, watching. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she was waiting for the right moment. Because when she finally spoke, this courtroom wouldn't know what hit it. The murmurs still echoed when Karoline Leavitt rose from her seat. No dramatic gestures, no forceful clearing of her throat. Just a calm, deliberate movement, the kind that commands attention without demanding it. The room, still charged with the weight of the prosecution's accusation, shifted as every eye turned to her. Every pen froze above its page. "Thank you, Your Honor," she began, her voice smooth, steady. "And thank you to the prosecution for such a vivid performance. Truly, if this were theater, they might even get a standing ovation." A few chuckles stirred from the back of the room, cautious, uncertain. Even the judge blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Karoline let that moment hang. Then her voice turned serious. "But this isn't theater. This is a court of law. And I didn't come here for applause. I came here for truth." The gallery quieted. She opened a folder slowly as if to say, "I'm not in a rush. I'm not worried. I know exactly what I'm doing." "Let's talk about the Hatch Act," she said, flipping to a marked page. "It was written in 1939. That's nearly a century ago. Before live streams, before smartphones, before social media, before this very courtroom had Wi-Fi." A few jurors cracked small smiles. Karoline's tone wasn't sarcastic. It was factual, but light enough to draw them in. "The prosecution claims I violated this law because of a single phrase. Our northern trade rivals are on their knees thanks to President Trump's tariff brilliance. They say this was political campaigning. I say it was policy reporting." She lifted a second document, a printed transcript. "This is the full record of the February 15th briefing. No campaign underway, no election within months, no calls to vote. Just a summary of what we believed the data showed at that time." She paced slowly in front of the jury. "And here's what matters. The Hatch Act doesn't prohibit public officials from speaking. It prohibits them from influencing electoral outcomes using their position." She turned to Judge Trevors, her voice firm now. "So I ask, where was the campaign? Where was the rallying cry? Where was the call to donate, to vote, to support a candidate?" Silence. "There wasn't one," she answered herself, "because that wasn't the goal. It was an analysis. Whether you agreed with the tone or not, it wasn't a campaign moment. It was a communications duty." The energy in the courtroom shifted, slightly but clearly. Karoline wasn't defending herself with emotion. She was disarming the entire accusation with logic, and the jury felt it. She turned to Drayton now, her expression neutral. "Let me offer a little legal clarity," she continued. "Section 5.2 of the Hatch Act states, and I quote, 'A violation must be demonstrably linked to campaign activity.'" She let that linger before adding, "That didn't happen here. There was no link, only assumption." Then she paused, letting her words sink in. "And let's talk about this recording." A visible ripple of tension moved through the gallery. "It was submitted this morning, after months of silence, after the briefing transcript had been vetted, after the original charge had been filed." Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but focus. "That's not due process. That's a late-game tactic." She let her hands fall calmly to her sides. "Your Honor, I'm not here to debate style. I'm here to uphold the law, and if this law matters, then it must be applied as it's written, not as someone wishes it would." The courtroom was still again, but not like before. Not the heavy silence of accusation. This was the quiet of respect. Karoline took a breath. In 2018, Jenkins v. U.S. Civil Ethics Commission clarified that the Hatch Act cannot be stretched to fit new formats unless Congress revises it. It's not just legal logistics, it's precedent. She stepped back, closing her folder slowly. "You don't have to agree with my politics, but you do have to follow the law, and the law says I did my job." With that, she returned to her seat. No fist pumps, no nods. Just calm. And for the first time since the trial began, the room leaned toward her, not because she was louder, but because she was clearer. The courtroom was frozen in anticipation. The prosecution's last-minute evidence, a 5-second audio clip, had sent shockwaves through the room. Now Karoline had dismantled it with nothing but clarity and composure. Drayton stood, his confidence slightly shaken, but still holding firm. "Your Honor," he said, his voice sharper than before, "the clip is real." The words were spoken. The jury should have the right to consider them. Karoline didn't react. She simply stepped toward the projector screen where the audio had been played moments before. "Anyone who's worked in media," she began, "knows 5 seconds of sound can be anything you want it to be, especially when you remove what came before and after." Drayton stiffened. "Objection, Your Honor," he snapped. "She's speculating." Karoline turned to him, measured and calm. "No, Counselor," she said. "I'm requesting verification." She faced the jury again. "You submitted a digital file with no timestamp, no source credentials, no verification method." Judge Travers held up a hand. "Let her finish." Karoline took a breath. "So let me offer some perspective. Here's what I actually said that day, as recorded by the official White House live stream." She lifted a set of papers from her folder and handed them to the bailiff, who distributed copies among the jurors and the judge. "The statement in question wasn't made in isolation," she continued. "The full sentence reads, 'Some might say they deserve the economic consequences of opposing our trade policy, but our job is to lead, not to gloat.'" A murmur spread through the courtroom. Not disbelief, realization. "The prosecution played 5 words," Karoline said. "I've given you 25, and context is everything." She paused, then added, "But let's go one step further." She turned back toward the judge. "Even if the quote had been as harsh as they claim, it still wouldn't violate the Hatch Act. Because tone isn't illegal. Sarcasm isn't a felony. The law regulates actions tied to campaigning, not commentary, not attitude, not political discomfort." She let that sink in. "This clip wasn't evidence," she said finally. "It was a tactic. And tactics don't belong in a courtroom unless they're honest." The judge removed his glasses, rubbing his temples. The energy in the room had shifted again. Karoline's voice grew firmer, but never louder. "So I respectfully request that the court treat this audio as provisional until its origin, authenticity, and edits can be independently verified." She turned to the judge. "And if the law truly values due process, it should demand nothing less." A silence followed, heavier than any before. Judge Travers looked down at the transcript in front of him. Then slowly, he turned to the prosecution. "Mr. Drayton," he said, his voice lower than before, "can you confirm the chain of custody for this recording?" Drayton hesitated. We received it through a confidential channel," he admitted. "We haven't had full time to authenticate." "Understood," Travers said. He leaned back. "Then for now, it remains provisional." A sharp exhale swept through the courtroom. Karoline sat back in her chair, as composed as ever. And in that moment, without yelling, without finger-pointing, she had dismantled their surprise move, not with emotion, but with clarity. The courtroom, once brimming with assumption, now leaned into hesitation. Because if the 5-second clip couldn't stand the light, then maybe the rest of the case couldn't either. The room had never been this quiet. Even the sound of a page turning felt like thunder. Every camera had stopped clicking. Every pen hovered in place. Judge Malcolm Travers sat motionless behind the bench, his glasses lowered halfway down his nose, fingertips resting against one another in deep thought. Across the aisle, Karoline Leavitt sat still, shoulders square, eyes forward, hands gently folded. She had just called out the prosecution's last-minute evidence, revealed its lack of authentication, and reframed the entire case, not as a legal violation, but as a misunderstanding of an outdated law. Now it was Travers' turn to speak, and everyone knew. Whatever he said next would echo far beyond the courtroom. Judge Travers exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers together in thought. The weight of the moment pressed against the walls of the courtroom, thick with anticipation. Every person in the room, reporters, jurors, attorneys, leaned forward slightly, waiting for his next words. Finally, he spoke. "Miss Leavitt, he began, his voice quieter than before. "When this case began, I'll admit I didn't expect much." A faint gasp rippled through the gallery. Karoline didn't react. "I thought I was about to hear a well-rehearsed defense," Travers continued, "crafted by political strategists, peppered with deflections." He paused. "But what I've seen, what I've heard, has made me pause." Even the court stenographer looked up, sensing the shift. "You didn't deflect, you didn't collapse under pressure, and more importantly, you didn't rely on theatrics." Travers lifted the thick file of legal documents Karoline had submitted. "You relied on law, on precedent, on reason." He turned toward Drayton. "And the audio clip submitted, late anonymously without full authentication, raises concerns." Drayton started to speak, but Travers raised a hand. "Not now, counselor." Then, turning back to Karoline, the judge continued, his tone measured. "Miss Leavitt, whether one agrees with your politics or not, you have made a compelling case, not just for your innocence, but for the importance of clarity in law." The room was silent, a courtroom filled with people yet devoid of sound. Travers took a breath. "I find that the evidence does not support a violation of the Hatch Act." The gallery tensed. "I find that the clip submitted lacks the authentication required to be considered valid in this court." A slow inhale rippled through the jurors. "And most importantly," Travers said, raising his gavel, "I find the defense's argument grounded, logical, and persuasive. Bang. This court finds Miss Karoline Leavitt not liable. Case dismissed." For a moment, nothing. Then, applause. Light at first. Then louder. From the back rows of the gallery where supporters stood, reporters scrambled to their phones, flashes burst to life again, the news already breaking. But Karoline, she didn't celebrate. She stood slowly, nodded once to the judge, and calmly began gathering her documents. Her expression didn't change, because she hadn't come to win. She had come to prove a point. Judge Travers stepped down from the bench. As he passed Karoline's table, he paused beside her, his voice lowered just for her to hear. "You've changed how I see that statute," he admitted. "And you've reminded me that law evolves, whether the courtroom is ready or not." Karoline looked up, her reply simple. "Thank you, Your Honor." And with that, he walked away. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the moment lingered, like the last note of a powerful symphony. Outside, the reporters were already waiting, hungry for a soundbite. But inside these walls, something greater had happened. A 27-year-old press secretary had stood alone. She had stared down outdated accusations, with nothing but a legal pad and a clear voice. And somehow she hadn't just won. She had reshaped the very rules they had tried to use against her. As Karoline stepped onto the stone steps of Summit Heights Federal Courthouse, the scene exploded. Cameras flashed like lightning, microphones stretched toward her from every angle. "Miss Leavitt, do you consider this a political victory? Do you think the Hatch Act needs to be rewritten? Any message for those who doubted you?" Karoline paused at the top step, back straight, eyes unwavering. "This wasn't about politics," she said. "It was about principle. The law must evolve with the times, not be used to silence those who speak for the public." And with that, she turned and walked toward the waiting black SUV, the door swinging shut behind her, like the end of a chapter. Inside the car, her phone buzzed. A familiar voice came through the speaker, confident, warm, unmistakably proud. "Karoline, you handled that brilliantly." She smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said. "I just stuck to the facts." "Well, you reminded a lot of people what real backbone looks like." She didn't say anything more. She didn't need to, because the truth didn't need to shout. It just needed to be heard. That evening, in the soft light of her Virginia home, Karoline stepped through the front door. Her husband stood in the living room, their infant son in his arms. No questions, no commentary, just pride in his eyes. "He watched it with me," he said with a smile. "At least until nap time." Karoline laughed quietly, taking her son into her arms and whispering into his ear. "Mommy spoke up today," she murmured. "One day you'll know how." She held him a little longer than usual, because this victory wasn't just about winning a case. It was about what came next. The following morning, the White House press room was standing room only. Reporters filled every seat. Cameras rolled. Some were curious, some skeptical. All were watching. Karoline walked to the podium, not rushed, not rattled, unshaken. "Before we begin today's briefing," she said, "I'd like to say this." A pause. "Laws must adapt. If they don't, they become weapons instead of shields." A quiet murmur. What we saw this week wasn't just about one statute or one statement. It was about how quickly the world changes, and how slowly law sometimes follows. But young people aren't waiting. We're showing up. We're speaking clearly. And if the law lags behind, we'll help carry it forward. A rare silence filled the room. Then, the briefing continued. But something had changed. The press didn't just take notes, they listened. Outside that room, her story ignited. Clips of the trial went viral. Legal analysts broke down her defense in detail. Hashtags soared across platforms. Aus Leavitt verdict, aus voices, with backbone. Law needs an update on college campuses, in coffee shops, on Capitol Hill. Conversations shifted. What exactly is the Hatch Act? Should we modernize it? Are younger voices being unfairly scrutinized under old rules? Karoline hadn't just won. She had started something. And back at her desk that afternoon, she sat quietly, typing up notes for next week's policy briefing. No press agents buzzing around her. No celebration banners. Just purpose. She looked out the window for a moment, calm, focused, and she smiled. Not because she had survived the storm, but because she knew how to walk through one and come out stronger. Because in the end, Karoline Leavitt didn't beg to be heard. She didn't demand respect. She earned it. Line by line, fact by fact, word by unshakable word. While others played politics, she played it straight. While they twisted the law, she held it up to the light. And in the end, it wasn't volume that won. It was clarity.